What if Prince was a 1950s rock and roll star? This week we'll be discussing Prince's pivotal importance in the history of rock and pop, and looking at the influences that connect him back to the first wave of rock and roll, as well as considering along the way, what exactly do we mean by rock and roll? All this and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and each Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these is that every week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Kiss by Prince, and I tried to reimagine that as a Chuck Berry style 1950s rock and roll song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, I recorded this week's What If track a few weeks ago, so I couldn't have anticipated this, but just very recently there's been quite a resurgence of interest and discussion of Prince among younger audiences due to the inclusion of When Doves Cry and Purple Rain on the soundtrack to the last ever episode of Stranger Things. And it's been quite interesting, really, to see a bunch of young people who maybe haven't really been exposed to his music before, discovering these tracks and trying to figure out who Prince was, what the music's all about, what he means in the kind of grand scheme of things. Because I think for those of us who just grew up with his music as kind of a constant, it's almost easy to take for granted his contribution to popular music, but seeing people who were born sort of this century discovering him kind of after the fact is really fascinating and reminds me not to take that for granted. So it's fun to see these fresh perspectives and to be reminded of just how important he was and continues to be. As I say, I'm of a generation who grew up with Prince just always being there, but in spite of that, I never really properly started to appreciate him until quite late on. I grew up knowing a bunch of the songs. I always quite enjoyed them, but I wasn't particularly invested, didn't sort of look terribly deeply into his stuff. You'd hear stuff on the radio, see videos on TV, but wasn't completely engaged with that. I think what really turned it around for me was one specific episode of TV, which was when the new Power Generation appeared on the old Channel 4 TV show The White Room. It was at the point where Prince was in his dispute with Warner Brothers, so he was in the face-covered, slave written on cheek phase, and he was not being billed as Prince. He was at the time touring just as a member of the new Power Generation, but it was very much the Prince show, and I think they did Get Wild and Count the Days on that show, and both performances were absolutely mind-blowing to me. I'd never really properly sat down and watched one of his performances that closely, but Get Wild with like two amazing bass lines going simultaneously and just this incredible over-the-top frenetic performance representing one side of his music, and then Count the Days, just this beautiful kind of soulful ballad with these lovely jazzy little incredibly tasteful bits of lead guitar that he was throwing in. Just after all these years of kind of semi-ignoring what he was doing made me kind of go, oh, hang on a minute, this guy's amazing. And then in the years after that, I gradually finally started to pick up records, go back through all these years of music that I'd missed and start to properly appreciate what he'd done. And the more I did that, the more I came to realise that as these records had gone along through the 1980s and into the 90s, they'd really reshaped so much of the musical landscape around them. Just his ability to synthesize together elements of all the best popular music of the previous 30, 40 years, combine them with whatever is the cutting edge sound of the day and make it into something completely new was pretty remarkable. So You have this sound that has echoes of classic funk and soul going all the way back through to early rock and roll, even to gospel, but also incorporating elements of kind of more white rock music from the Beatles through to Devo, mixing the grittiest, most sort of organic, human, soulful elements with these kind of glassy, ultra-modern, almost robotic technological elements. It kind of arrived right at the turn of the 80s with this completely new sound and just reshaped the whole sound of popular music. To an extent, I think it's probably fair to say that he was the single most significant artist of the 1980s, not just in R&B or funk, but pretty much across the entire spectrum of popular music. And I've seen people make this argument occasionally online, and normally what happens is that 15 people will dive on going, but what about Michael Jackson? And I mean, I have no intention of weighing in on Michael Jackson's bizarre personal life, and I'm not here to run down his talent. He was a tremendous entertainer, a very good singer, a peerless dancer and stage performer, and made at least 2 or 3 very, very good albums. But honestly, I don't think he's even remotely in the same league as Prince. I mean, if you look at the two of them in the same time frame, I guess Michael Jackson's first great album, Off the Wall, it's a fantastic album, but I mean, that's still very much like a 1970s relic. It's a disco album. It's a very good disco album. I'm not one of these disco naysayers. There was a lot of great disco music, but it was a genre that was pretty quickly ruined by bandwagon jumpers. But Off the Wall's a great disco album, but it is still right in the coattails of that trend. Whereas by the time Prince is hitting his second album through to Dirty Mind, it sounds like he's operating in another century, not just another decade. It just kind of blows that 1970s bow tie wearing disco nonsense out the water. And I think it's very obvious that by the time Thriller comes around, there's a distinct move towards more of that kind of crossover sound with stronger funk elements, stronger hints of rock in there. And it already feels like the team behind Michael Jackson is reacting to what Prince is doing. And I think it's also important to emphasize that there's a team behind Michael Jackson. A lot of this is coming from Quincy Jones, outside songwriters as well. Whereas Prince, particularly on those first 3 albums, it's just him. He's writing the songs, he's playing all the instruments. Michael Jackson's a tremendous performer, but with a really strong team moulding him into this finished product. And then by the time you get around to Bad in 1987, I think that's even more obviously trying to follow in Prince's footsteps. It's kind of a PG Prince. It's obviously going for a tougher, harder funk edge. It's trying to be sexier. Obviously it was very effective. It's tremendously commercial. It's got a broader appeal than what Prince is doing, because it doesn't feel quite as edgy. It doesn't feel quite as dangerous. It's quite a bit less grown up. But that record wouldn't exist without Prince, even though it was commercially stratospheric and far bigger than Prince could ever have hoped to be. Artistically, he was always kind of playing catch up. And yeah, undoubtedly, Michael Jackson's performing skills were hugely influential, but in terms of actual music, I think particularly for that decade, but also into the 90s, Prince was leading and everyone else, Michael Jackson included, was following. I think one of the things that makes Prince's stuff so appealing is that although it managed to synthesize his influences into something that seemed really new and bold and stunning, at the same time, you could really sense this whole world of historical influences that were flowing through everything that he did. So there were always things that felt familiar in there, even if presented in new or surprising ways. And although I guess the funk influences, the James Brown and the George Clinton influences are particularly notable, I think his sort of 50s rock influences are very apparent too. I mean, the one that people will always mention is Little Richard, which is definitely fair enough from his image, that kind of outrageous, flamboyant, androgynous style, the tendency to playfully mess around with people's taboos about sexuality, both in terms of the way they portrayed themselves on stage and in the lyrics of their songs. I mean, if you look at things like Jack You Off by Prince, that could be a Little Richard lyric. It's not a million miles away from something like Long Tall Sally. you can definitely see Little Richard as an absolute prototype for what Prince was doing in the 80s. But I think beyond that, there's a whole load of other stuff from the early rock and roll days that you can see in Prince too. I mean, I think Chuck Berry certainly also must have been an influence in terms of the showmanship, the way he wielded his guitar as a prop, I think is something that you absolutely see Prince doing. And again, there's parallels with the synthesis of these different influences into something new, because I guess Chuck Berry was largely coming out of the Chicago blues scene, but the sound that he was creating, although it was built on the Chicago blues, he was also incorporating strong elements of country music. He was incorporating bits of Latin American music, into jazz as well. And I think Prince definitely did a similar thing with just assimilating these different, seemingly conflicting styles sometimes and somehow creating a coherent whole out of them. So there's definitely some Chuck Berry in there. And I'd say also Bo Diddley, I think, is a really important precedent for some of the stuff that Prince was doing. If you look at old Bo Diddley performances, again, the outrageous showmanship, the use of custom-made signature guitars as part of his image. I mean, that's something that I remember vividly from some of my earliest Prince performances. I saw like the cloud guitar or the guitar shaped like his trademark symbol. There's some just outrageous designs that became inextricably linked with him, and that's just the same as Bo Diddley with his kind of rectangular Gretsch and, you know, his mixed gender bands, which is really unusual back in Bo Diddley's day, having like Lady Bo on guitar or the Duchess, which I think is really mirrored in The Revolution, having Wendy and Lisa there. Again, you know, bands still to this day are quite often really macho things, so I think it kind of makes a statement prominently featuring female musicians, and I think that's something that's definitely a parallel between Prince and these early rock and roll legends too. So that's kind of part of what made me connect the dots between the two. I should say, when I said rock and roll this week, I was very much sort of really thinking just of the Chuck Berry strand of rock and roll. Rock and roll, like a lot of these genre terms we throw around, it's not always that useful on its own without some further qualification, because like a lot of genres, there's no one definitive rock and roll sound, I would argue, and there's no one moment where rock and roll came into existence. It's one of these enduring debates: what was the first rock and roll record? And no one can really answer it. Everyone's got their own idea, but there really wasn't a starting point. It was one of these things where several different styles of music were all kind of converging on a similar point. So you have the sort of jump R&B scene, which is developing out of jazz. I guess big band jazz is falling out of favour. It's a bit easier to run small bands, playing this kind of slightly simplified, high energy variant of big band stuff. At the same time that's happening, I guess Western swing has really hit its stride. So a sort of hybrid between country music and swing music, quite often again blues based, high energy dance music. While that's all going on, as I say, the blues has moved up from the deep south with the sort of industrial migration to Chicago, where people start picking up electric guitars. You get the electric blues, this much raunchier rhythmic form of the blues. And at the same time, aside from Western swing, other forms of country music are also developing towards a more kind of stripped down, rougher and rowdier, more energetic, bluesy sound. Energetic, pretty kind of gutsy, pretty raunchy variants of country music that are just all edging towards this common ground that eventually becomes rock and roll music. And you can argue until the cows come home about where it starts. People will say Rocket 88 was the start of it. People say Sister Rosetta Tharpe with a bluesy, electrified gospel. If you want to go back further than that, I've got a bunch of records by Albert Ammons, the great boogie woogie pianist, which if you stuck a drum kit on that, that's a rock and roll record. There is no exact start point, is my point. We call it all rock and roll because it's easier than trying to separate it off into 15 different subgenres. But the type of rock and roll I was looking at specifically this week was very much the Chuck Berry strand, but I may well revisit 50s rock and look at a different kind of strand. Rockabilly is really interesting to look at to me, or the more kind of jump R&B based stuff, you know, the kind of thing that Freddie Bell and the Bell Boys did. That's really interesting. The stuff that grew out of Western swing, like the Bill Haley stuff, that again I find fascinating, so I'll probably revisit all those in the future too. Well, anyway, that leads me to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternative timeline this week, the universe is quite similar to our own, except that in this universe, Prince Rogers Nelson was actually born back in 1937. So he grows up in Minneapolis back in the 30s, obviously kind of a bit isolated from the big music scenes that are going on the East and West Coast, as well as the blues in Chicago, as I mentioned. But he's listening to the radio avidly. He's a natural musician, so he's playing on the family piano. He picks up a guitar pretty early, and he's just hearing all the different stuff on the radio, from blues songs, jazz songs, gospel. He's taking it all in and learning it all. Starts performing just locally, builds a local following, and then as he hits his 18th birthday, he decides to take the show out on the road, playing this original music. So starts working his way across the Midwest, just playing one-night stands wherever he can. Ends up in Chicago on some Alan Freed bill, supporting a couple of doo-wop groups. And as luck would have it, the Chess Brothers are in the audience that night when he makes his debut, and they're astonished to see this performer who combines the wild, sort of androgynous image of Little Richard with the incredible guitar-slinging theatrics of Chuck Berry, despite the fact that he's never actually encountered either of these performers before. He's got this raw, early rock and roll sound that is developed completely in isolation, so they're flabbergasted by this, immediately sign him up, and his first single on the Chess label is Kiss, which is a great record, but unfortunately for mainstream America, he's just a little bit too flamboyant, a little bit too edgy. So although his songs are popular with R&B audiences, he never quite makes that mainstream breakthrough. Pat Boone covers a couple of his songs with bowdlerized lyrics and does have big hits with them, but doesn't really get his due until a few years later when the British invasion bands start coming through, and a bunch of them are covering Prince songs because he's been a vital influence. He realises that Europe's where his audience is, moves over there and tours successfully, and is hailed as a legend and a formative influence on all these new bands who redefine rock through the 60s. So, in attempting to turn Kiss into a 1950s rock and roll song, my first step as ever is just getting the isolated vocal, dropping into GarageBand, syncing it up to the grid. That done, I cranked up the tempo a bit because rather than it being funky, I wanted it to have more of a driving rock and roll feel. Next thing I did was program the drums, kept the drum patterns pretty simple. I was listening to old Chuck Berry records, and a lot of the times on those there's pretty much no fills, it's just straight ahead driving rhythms. I wanted that Chuck Berry feel, which is a little bit swung, so that's kind of the rhythm I went for, and then just tried to EQ it so it did sound like a slightly muffled 50s recording, you know, drum kit as far away from the mic as possible to avoid everything distorting. Bass wise, rather than using electric bass, I used GarageBand's Studio Upright bass sound for that double bass sound, which I played in on my MIDI keyboard because I wanted that 50s feel. And then guitar-wise, I've got a couple of guitars on there. One just playing a very strict Chuck Berry rhythm, you know, bar chords with the little finger just rocking back and forth from the 5th to the 6th, chugging away to give it that drive and momentum that you get on those records. And then the other one just doing very sort of standard Chuck Berry-ish leads with double stops and the bends and the little kind of stabbing fills in between vocal lines, that kind of thing. Added some piano, trying to go a bit for the Johnny Johnson sort of thing, maybe a little bit of what Little Richard would have played. I'm that terrible pianist, but tried to just keep it simple but driving. And that was more or less it. The only other thing that I felt like I wanted to try was maybe some horns. GarageBand horn sounds aren't great, so I mix them up too high, but all I've got on there is a low sax, so trying to replicate a baritone sax sound, and also a trombone, just in unison, doing a little kind of thing to reinforce the bass line on the choruses. I think it comes on the second chorus and then each one after that. And then for the video, as ever, started out with just some footage of Prince back in the 80s performing the song, found some good live footage of that, flipped it into black and white because obviously wanted to give it a nice 50s period feel, and then obviously rather than wanting to focus on the very 80s musicians of the revolution, I wanted to give him some more period authentic musicians. Annoyingly, all the best footage of Chuck Berry and Little Richard with bands seems to be actually from more into the 60s, so I guess we're saying this is one of the videos of him when he's touring in Europe in the 60s. So we've got some footage of Chuck Berry doing his thing, from I think Belgian TV in the early 60s, with a great backing band and a really square looking audience. And for the pianist, I've got Little Richard, I think in the UK, again in the 60s, with a slightly hipper, younger audience who are having a much better time. So just edited those all together to try and give the impression that it's all happening at once. And this is Prince back in his rock and roll heyday with a rocking band, wowing European audiences. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. I mean, I love Prince. I've always loved the song Kiss, and 50s rock and roll is pretty much the first music I was ever into. The first record I ever owned was a Chuck Berry double album, which my dad gave me when I was about 4, so it's been something I've been obsessed with forever. So it was great fun for me to try and put these two things together. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe, share, all that stuff always really helps. I appreciate your support. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any songs or artists or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. I definitely always welcome your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.